The deputy's flashlight swept once across the backyard, then settled on the woman standing near the dock, arms crossed, halfway across a property line marked by a wooden sign that had been there for 11 years. "Ma'am, I need you to step back onto the public side of that sign," the deputy said, calm and even. "This is posted private property." "I've walked this way every single day for 2 months," Bernadette Kowalski said, her voice sharp with a particular confidence of someone who had never once been told no and didn't expect to start now. "Where I'm from, this kind of thing doesn't fly. Nobody owns a walking path." "You're not in New York anymore, ma'am," the deputy said, not unkindly, just factually. "Florida trespass law works a little differently, and it's about to matter a great deal to you." Dale Whitfield stood a few feet away on his own patio, arms folded, saying nothing yet. He'd lived on this stretch of canal-front property for 26 years. He'd posted that sign himself, on his own land, following the exact language the county recommended, back when the whole thing had seemed like an unnecessary precaution rather than something he'd ever actually need. What Bernadette didn't know, what she hadn't bothered to find out in the 2 months since she'd moved down from New York and decided that the strip of grass along Dale's canal frontage was hers to walk through whenever she pleased, was that Florida didn't treat posted private property the way she assumed it did. And the deputy standing in Dale's backyard right now was about to explain exactly what that meant, in a way that was going to change the rest of Bernadette's evening considerably. "I'll be filing a formal complaint about harassment," Bernadette said, pulling out her phone. "This is completely unreasonable." "Ma'am," the deputy said, "you're currently standing on posted private property after being asked to leave. I'd encourage you to step back and let me finish explaining the actual law here, because right now you're the one accumulating a problem, not Mr. Whitfield." To understand how a quiet canal front backyard ended up with a deputy laying out Florida trespass statutes to a stunned new neighbor, you have to go back 2 months, to the day Bernadette Kowalski moved in next door, decided the rules she'd known up north simply traveled with her, and found out slowly and then all at once that they didn't. Dale Whitfield was 61, retired after 3 decades running a small marine repair business, and he'd lived in the same canal-front home in a quiet southwest Florida community for 26 years. His property backed onto a narrow residential canal, with a private dock he'd built himself and maintained meticulously, and a stretch of mowed grass running along the water's edge that belonged entirely to his lot, according to both his deed and the subdivision's recorded plat. It wasn't ambiguous. The property line ran along a surveyed boundary that placed the entire grassy strip, the dock, and roughly 15 feet of yard past it, squarely inside Dale's ownership. There was no public easement, no shared access agreement, nothing in the HOA's covenants suggesting otherwise. Years earlier, after a minor dispute with a different neighbor about lawn equipment cutting across the yard, Dale had posted a single, simple sign at the edge of his property, exactly as the county sheriff's office had once advised him to: "Private property, and no trespassing," bolted to a post, visible from both directions. For years, it had never mattered much. The community was easygoing, mostly retirees and long-time residents who respected property lines out of habit as much as anything else. Then, 2 months before the night the deputy showed up, Bernadette Kowalski and her husband moved in 3 houses down, having relocated from a suburb outside New York City. Bernadette was in her early 50s, recently retired from a corporate job, and by every account from neighbors who'd interacted with her since, she'd arrived with a very clear sense of how things were supposed to work and very little patience for being told otherwise. Within her first 2 weeks, she joined the HOA board, filling an open seat nobody else had wanted, and had already sent 2 community-wide emails about tightening up standards for lawn maintenance and holiday decorations, an aggressive start for someone who hadn't yet been in the neighborhood a full month. It was around that same time that Dale first noticed Bernadette cutting across the edge of his property, walking her small dog along the grassy strip beside the canal, past his dock, and back toward her own house on the other side. He assumed reasonably that she simply hadn't noticed the property line or the sign, and mentioned it to her directly the next time he saw her, in a friendly, unremarkable way. "Oh, I didn't realize," Bernadette said at the time, waving a hand. "It's just such a nice walking path. Where I'm from, everybody walks through everybody's yard along the water. Nobody makes a big deal out of it. Dale explained, still friendly, that Florida property law didn't generally work that way, and that the strip was part of his deeded lot. Bernadette nodded, said something non-committal, and kept walking her dog through his yard the very next morning. By the third week, Dale realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. He mentioned it again, more directly this time, standing near the dock as Bernadette approached with her dog on its leash. I know I brought this up before, but this stretch is private property. I'd really appreciate it if you'd use the sidewalk out front instead. Bernadette's expression shifted, the friendliness draining out of it. It's a few feet of grass, Dale. I'm not damaging anything. This kind of thing is exactly the small-minded attitude that gives HOAs a bad reputation. It was an odd thing to hear from someone who had just spent her first month on the board tightening rules about mailbox paint colors. But Dale let it go, mostly because he still didn't think it was worth a real conflict over a walking path. That assumption didn't hold for long. The following week, Dale came home from a morning fishing trip to find Bernadette standing at the edge of his dock, phone raised, photographing his boat and the storage containers along the side of his shed. "Can I help you with something?" Dale asked, setting his cooler down at the top of the yard. "I'm documenting a potential HOA violation," Bernadette said, not lowering the phone. "Storage containers visible from the water violate community aesthetic standards. I'm required to report this." Dale kept his voice level, though the visit onto his dock, uninvited, was starting to feel less like an oversight and more like a pattern. "Bernadette, you're standing on my dock right now. This is private property, same as the strip of yard you've been walking your dog across for weeks." "I'm a board member," she said, as if that settled the matter. "I have every right to document violations anywhere in this community." "You don't have the right to walk onto someone's private dock without permission, regardless of what position you hold on the board," Dale said. "HOA authority doesn't override property lines. If you think there's a violation, the process is to note it and have it addressed through the board, not to come onto my dock and take photos." Bernadette lowered the phone slightly, though her expression didn't soften. "I don't think you understand how seriously the board takes community standards. I've seen how things were run here before I arrived, and frankly, it's been far too lax. Storage containers, unapproved landscaping, people letting property maintenance slide for years. I'm not going to apologize for actually doing the job." "You can do the job from the sidewalk," Dale said. "You don't need to be standing on my dock to write a note about a storage container." "This is exactly the kind of resistance I expected," Bernadette said, stepping off the dock but not toward the sidewalk, instead cutting directly back across the grassy strip along the water, the same path she'd been using for weeks, walking past Dale without another word. Dale stood there for a moment, more unsettled than angry, trying to figure out how a conversation about a walking path had turned into a woman photographing his property from his own dock and citing her board position as if it granted her access to private land. He went inside, sat down at his kitchen table, and for the first time in 26 years of living in that house, pulled out the folder containing his original deed and the subdivision's recorded plat map, just to confirm, on paper, exactly where his property began and ended. It confirmed exactly what he already knew. The dock, the grassy strip, and roughly 15 feet beyond it were entirely his. There was no shared access clause anywhere in the HOA's covenants, no public easement noted on the plat, nothing that could reasonably be read as granting any resident, board member or otherwise, a right to walk or stand on that land without permission. He photographed the "No Trespassing" sign that evening, noting the date, partly out of habit and partly because some instinct told him this particular disagreement wasn't going to resolve itself the way the earlier ones with other neighbors always had. Dale's answer, for now, was to keep documenting rather than escalating. He didn't call the HOA. He didn't post anything online. He simply kept a written log, dates, times, what was said, and waited to see whether Bernadette would eventually recognize the boundary on her own, or whether this was going to require something more direct. It required something far more direct than he expected. 4 days later, an official HOA violation notice arrived in Dale's mailbox, citing unauthorized storage structures visible from shared waterway and referencing community aesthetic standards, with a 14-day compliance window and a $200 fine if the storage containers weren't relocated or screened from view. Dale read the notice twice. The photographs referenced in the letter had clearly been taken from his own dock, the same day Bernadette had stood there uninvited. He called the HOA management office and, after a short conversation, confirmed that Bernadette herself had submitted the complaint and the accompanying photos, and had specifically requested she be the one to follow up with Dale directly rather than routing it through the standard process. That follow-up came the next evening, in the form of Bernadette walking across the grassy strip again, the same path, the same disregard for the sign, this time holding a printed copy of the violation notice. "I wanted to give you the chance to resolve this before it escalates further," she said, stopping a few feet from where Dale was watering a planter near his patio. "Bernadette, you're on my property again, walking the same path I've asked you 3 times not to use. And this violation notice is based on photos taken from my dock, which you were also not supposed to be on. I was performing HOA duties." "You were trespassing to perform HOA duties," Dale said, keeping his tone even despite his patience clearly wearing thin. "Those are 2 different things, and no amount of board authority changes that." Bernadette's posture stiffened. "If you want to be difficult about a simple compliance issue, that's your choice. But I want you to know I'm documenting this conversation as well. I've had multiple residents mention concerns about your attitude lately. And if this continues, I don't see why I wouldn't involve law enforcement to establish a record." "Involve law enforcement over storage containers? Over your escalating behavior toward a board member trying to do her job," Bernadette said. "Where I'm from, this kind of stonewalling doesn't happen. People respect the process." "Where you're from doesn't apply here," Dale said, quietly but firmly. "This is Florida. My property line is recorded, my dock is private, and the path you keep walking across isn't a shared amenity. I've told you that 4 times now." Bernadette didn't respond to that directly. She turned and walked back the way she'd come, across the same disputed strip of grass, without so much as glancing at the sign a few feet to her left. 2 days later, Dale found a second notice, this one a formal warning letter from the HOA board, though notably, when he checked the board meeting minutes later, it turned out this letter had never actually been discussed or approved by the full board. Bernadette had issued it under the board's letterhead unilaterally, citing continued noncompliance and hostile conduct toward association representatives, and adding a new threat. If the situation wasn't resolved within 7 days, she would be contacting the sheriff's non-emergency line to document what she called a pattern of intimidation from a resident toward HOA leadership. Dale didn't respond to the letter directly. Instead, he called the county sheriff's non-emergency line himself, not to report anything urgent, but to ask a straightforward question. What exactly did Florida law require of a homeowner who wanted to formally establish that a posted "no trespassing" sign meant what it said, especially with someone who kept crossing it anyway despite repeated verbal requests to stop? The deputy who took the call explained it plainly. Florida's trespass statute didn't require a homeowner to repeat a warning indefinitely. A posted sign, combined with a verbal request to leave and not return, was generally sufficient. If someone continued to enter after that, deputies could issue a formal trespass warning on the spot, and further violations after that warning could result in an arrest, not just a lecture. Dale thanked the deputy, hung up, and for the first time in this entire situation, felt like he finally understood exactly what his next step needed to be. For nearly a week, things went quiet. Bernadette didn't send any more notices. She wasn't seen walking her dog along the canal strip, at least not during the hours Dale was usually outside. The HOA's regular monthly email went out on schedule, full of ordinary community announcements, without a single mention of storage containers or compliance issues. Dale almost let himself believe the situation had cooled off on its own. He spent the weekend doing routine maintenance on his boat, had a quiet dinner on the patio with his wife, and for a few days, the yard felt like it had for the 26 years before Bernadette moved in. A neighbor 2 houses down, a long-time resident named Frank, who'd served on the board years earlier, mentioned to Dale in passing that he'd heard Bernadette had been asked by at least one other board member to stop issuing notices without full board approval, after her unilateral warning letter came up informally in conversation. Frank didn't have full details, but the implication was clear. Dale wasn't the only one who had noticed something off about how she was operating. Dale appreciated hearing it, but the quiet didn't fully put him at ease. Everything he'd seen from Bernadette over the past month suggested she wasn't the type to simply let a disagreement go, especially not one where she'd already committed publicly to being right. He kept his log updated anyway, dates and times, along with a printed copy of his deed and the plat map, kept together in a folder by the back door, close enough to grab quickly if he ever needed it again. On a Tuesday evening, watering the planters near his dock, Dale noticed Bernadette standing at the edge of her own yard, watching in his direction for a long moment before turning and going back inside. She didn't cross onto his property. She didn't say anything. But something about the way she'd stood there, arms crossed, made Dale suspect the quiet wasn't really resolution. It was just a pause. 2 days later, just after sunset, he heard his dog barking at the back of the house and stepped outside to find Bernadette standing at the edge of his dock again, her own small dog off its leash, sniffing along the grass well past the sign. Dale didn't confront her directly this time. He stepped back inside, called the sheriff's non-emergency line, gave the address, and calmly explained that a neighbor was once again on his posted private property after multiple verbal requests to stay off it. Within 15 minutes, a deputy's cruiser pulled into the driveway. The deputy who arrived introduced himself simply as Deputy Ortiz, a composed man in his 40s who walked the property with an unhurried, methodical manner. Bernadette was still near the dock when he arrived, her dog now back on its leash, her expression shifting quickly from irritation to something more performative the moment she saw the uniform. "Officer, thank goodness," she said. "This has been an ongoing pattern of harassment from this resident. I'm a board member, and I've felt increasingly targeted every time I try to address community issues." Deputy Ortiz glanced between them. "Ma'am, can you tell me why you're currently standing past that sign?" He nodded toward the "No Trespassing" post a few feet away. "I was just walking my dog. This is a walking path we've always used." "Is this your property?" "No, but—" "Sir," Ortiz said, turning to Dale, "what's your account?" "This is my property, recorded in my deed," Dale said. "I've asked this neighbor verbally at least 4 times over the past 6 weeks to stop walking and standing on this strip and on my dock. I called earlier this week to confirm what Florida law required, and I was told a posted sign plus a verbal warning was generally enough to support a formal trespass warning if it continued. It's continued." "Ma'am," Ortiz said, "were you asked previously to stay off this property?" Bernadette hesitated. "There was a disagreement about it, yes, but I didn't think it was serious. It's just a strip of grass. Under Florida law, it doesn't need to be serious to be private property," Ortiz said. "If it's posted and you've been told to leave and not return, continuing to enter after that can be treated as trespassing, regardless of how minor it seems." "This is absurd," Bernadette said, her composure slipping. "I'm a board member here. I have community responsibilities. HOA board membership doesn't grant a legal right to enter private property," Ortiz said. "That authority comes from the deed, not from a board position." Dale stepped forward and handed over a folder. The recorded deed showing his lot lines, the subdivision plat map confirming no shared easement existed along the canal strip, and his written log documenting each date he'd asked Bernadette to stay off the property, along with the unapproved warning letter she'd sent on HOA letterhead without full board authorization. Ortiz reviewed the documents carefully. "This shows the dock and this grass strip are entirely part of your recorded lot," he said to Dale, then turned back to Bernadette. "Ma'am, do you have anything showing a legal right of access here? An easement, a shared use agreement, anything recorded?" It's how things worked where I used to live," Bernadette said, quieter now. "I didn't realize it would actually be treated this seriously." "Florida trespass law doesn't require you to realize it," Ortiz said. "It requires that the property be posted, and that you were told to leave. Both of those happened here more than once, according to Mr. Whitfield's account and this log." Bernadette looked toward Dale, some of the earlier sharpness gone from her expression, replaced by something closer to genuine surprise. "You're really going to let this become a police matter over a walking path?" "I didn't want it to become one," Dale said. I asked you 4 times. Politely, the first 3. I only called tonight because you were back on the dock again, with a dog off its leash, after everything that had already happened. Deputy Ortiz closed his notepad and addressed them both plainly. Ma'am, based on what's documented here, I'm issuing you a formal trespass warning for this property. That means from this point forward, if you enter this yard or this dock again without Mr. Whitfield's express permission, it can result in an arrest for trespassing, not just another warning. Bernadette's voice caught slightly. A warning. Like an official one? On record. Yes, ma'am. I'll document it, and a copy stays on file. This isn't a punishment for a misunderstanding. It's a formal notice, because the informal requests weren't enough. He turned to Dale. You're within your rights to keep documenting any future incidents. And if this continues after tonight, you can call and reference this warning directly. Bernadette didn't say much else. She collected her dog, said something brief about following up with the board, and walked back toward her own house, this time using the sidewalk out front rather than the grassy strip along the canal. The aftermath moved quietly. The unapproved violation notice and warning letter Bernadette had issued were formally withdrawn by the full HOA board the following week, after Dale forwarded his documentation, including the deputy's report number, to the board's official email. 2 other board members, who Dale later learned had already grown uneasy with how Bernadette had been operating since joining, used the incident to push through a new internal policy requiring any compliance notice to be reviewed and approved by at least 2 board members before being sent. Bernadette remained on the board for a short while longer, but according to neighbors, she stepped down within a couple of months, citing personal reasons. Whether that was related to the trespass warning or simply the natural end of an uncomfortable chapter, nobody could say for certain, and Dale, for his part, never brought it up again. It wasn't a dramatic ending. There was no viral confrontation, no shouting match, no public vindication beyond a quiet correction that unfolded almost entirely through paperwork and a single, calm deputy explaining a law that had been true the entire time, whether or not anyone had bothered to check it first. In the weeks that followed, Dale's yard went back to being exactly what it had always been, a quiet stretch of grass along the canal, his dock undisturbed, the sign still standing where he'd put it years earlier, now simply respected rather than ignored. When Frank asked him about it over a fence one afternoon, Dale mostly shrugged. I didn't do anything special. I asked nicely more than once, and when that didn't work, I found out what the law actually said and let that do the talking instead of me. Bernadette, in the time before she left the board, became noticeably more careful about which paths she walked and which properties she photographed. The community, for its part, returned to the same easygoing rhythm it had always had, the whole episode fading into the kind of story neighbors mention occasionally at gatherings, more as a curiosity than a grudge. Nobody treated it as a victory over Bernadette personally. It felt more like a simple reminder, one that applies well beyond a canal front yard in Florida, that assumptions about how things work somewhere else don't automatically transfer, and that a clearly posted boundary, backed up by an actual law, tends to hold up a great deal better than confidence alone. At the end of the day, this was never really a story about a walking path or a storage container. It was about what happens when someone assumes the rules they were used to somewhere else simply travel with them, without ever checking whether the place they've landed actually works that way. Dale never raised his voice beyond a firm, steady tone. He didn't argue online, and he didn't escalate things himself until every reasonable, polite option had already been tried. He asked. He documented. And when the moment finally called for it, he let a deputy and a straightforward Florida statute finish the conversation he'd been trying to have for weeks. If you enjoyed this story, consider liking the video and subscribing for more calm, grounded HOA and Karen Karma stories like it. We've got another one coming soon, involving a disputed shared driveway and a homeowner who kept far more evidence than anyone expected. And we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a neighbor, new or otherwise, assume the rules from somewhere else simply applied where you live? Tell us what happened in the comments. Some of the best stories on this channel started exactly that way.